Israeli lawmakers are making a push to allow Jews to pray at a disputed holy site.
"48 hours ago, access to the Temple Mount was quietly restricted. No official explanation. 36 hours ago, seismographs recorded patterns that made no scientific sense. 12 hours ago, witnesses reported seeing something that hasn't been documented in Jerusalem for 2,000 years. And 3 hours ago, the first footage leaked. What you're about to see is already being removed from other platforms. The first sign that something was unfolding came not from official channels, not from government statements or prepared press conferences, but from silence itself. The kind of silence that descends when authorities know more than they're willing to share with the public, when doors close without explanation, and access points that have stood open for decades suddenly require clearance that no one seems able to obtain. On Tuesday morning, without warning, without the usual bureaucratic announcements that typically precede such decisions, Israeli authorities placed unprecedented restrictions on the Temple Mount, limiting access in ways that haven't been seen since the most volatile periods of regional tension. And yet this time, there were no protests in the streets, no political crisis triggering the lockdown, no immediate threat that could justify such measures to the thousands of pilgrims and worshippers who arrive daily to one of the most contested and sacred sites on earth. The official statement, when it finally came 18 hours later, mentioned routine structural assessments, but those who have studied the patterns of information control in sensitive religious sites recognized immediately that the language was too vague, too carefully constructed, the kind of phrasing that conceals rather than reveals. But it was what happened next that transformed bureaucratic caution into something far more disturbing. 36 hours before this moment, seismograph stations positioned throughout Jerusalem and the surrounding Judean hills began registering activity that geologists are still struggling to categorize. Not the sharp jolts of tectonic plates grinding against each other, not the rumbling signatures of volcanic activity, but something else entirely. Patterns that repeated at intervals too precise to be natural. Rhythmic disturbances that seemed to pulse rather than shake, emanating from a depth that instruments couldn't quite pinpoint with the accuracy that modern technology should allow. Dr. Sarah Feldman, a seismologist at the Geophysical Institute of Israel, spoke briefly to local reporters before her department stopped granting interviews, and in that brief window, she said something that has since been replayed thousands of times across social media platforms, her words carrying a weight that transcends scientific observation into something approaching unease. "We're seeing waveforms that don't match our existing models," she said, choosing her words with visible care, her eyes betraying something that her professional language couldn't quite conceal. "The pattern suggests deliberate rhythm, rather than chaotic natural movement. I've been studying seismic activity in this region for 23 years, and I've never encountered readings like this." When pressed to elaborate, she simply shook her head and walked away from the cameras, and her department has not responded to media requests since. The readings she referenced have not been made publicly available, but sources within the geological community, speaking on condition of anonymity, describe graphs that show disturbances occurring in 7-second intervals, pausing for exactly 40 seconds, then resuming, a pattern that continued for nearly 6 hours before stopping as abruptly as it began. 7 and 40. Numbers that carry weight in biblical numerology, numbers that appear throughout Scripture with significance that scholars have debated for millennia. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the reports that began filtering through social media 12 hours ago. Eyewitness accounts from people who were near the Old City when the seismic readings were being recorded, people who described not just feeling tremors but hearing something, a sound that seemed to come from beneath the ancient stones themselves, resonant and deep, like the sustained note of an instrument too large to exist, a frequency that they felt in their chests more than heard with their ears. One such witness, a tour guide named Marcus Schulman, who has worked in Jerusalem for 37 years, posted a video that has now been viewed over 2 million times, though it keeps being removed from major platforms and re-uploaded by users who downloaded it before the deletions. In the video, his hands visibly shaking as he holds his phone, Marcus describes standing near the western wall when the sound began, his voice tight, with something between awe and fear. "It wasn't like anything I've experienced in earthquakes," he says, his eyes still wide with the memory. "It was almost a musical, like the stones themselves were resonating. And people around me, we all stopped talking at the same moment. We all felt it. Some of the older men, the ones who pray at the wall every day, they started reciting psalms immediately. They knew. Somehow they knew this wasn't ordinary." The video ends abruptly, mid-sentence, as though something interrupted him, something he chose not to record. And what Marcus didn't say in that video, what he only shared in a now-deleted follow-up post, was what he saw when he looked up at the sky above the dome of the rock in that moment of resonant sound. The first reports came not from official channels but from the edges, from the margins where truth often hides before it floods into the light. A tour guide named Yael, standing near the western wall at approximately 4:47 inches the morning, felt it before she saw it, a vibration that moved through the ancient stones like a whisper through bones, subtle at first, then unmistakable, then impossible to ignore. She described it later, her voice still trembling in the video that spread through private messaging groups before disappearing from public view, as a sensation that seemed to come from beneath and above simultaneously, as though the earth and sky were communicating in a language older than human speech. But Yael was not alone. Within the same 17-minute window, between 4:47 and 5:04 that Thursday morning, at least 43 individuals in different locations throughout Jerusalem's Old City reported experiencing identical phenomena. The vibration, yes, but also something else, something that made even the secular among them reach for religious vocabulary, because no other words seemed adequate to contain what their senses were telling them. A Muslim shopkeeper preparing for dawn prayers near the Damascus Gate said the air itself changed texture, became thick, almost solid, like moving through honey or passing through a veil that separated one reality from another. His hands shook as he demonstrated, pressing against invisible resistance that only he could feel, that only those present in that moment could understand. 3 blocks away, a Christian pilgrim from Ohio, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret, who had saved for 15 years to make this journey, stood frozen in the courtyard of the church, of the Holy Sepulchre, her camera hanging useless at her side, because, as she later told her daughter in a phone call that was recorded and shared against her wishes, some moments are too sacred to photograph, too heavy with meaning to reduce to pixels and screens. What did she see? She would not say directly, would only repeat that the light changed, that shadows fell in directions that violated every law of physics she had ever taught, that for the span of perhaps 90 seconds, the sun seemed to stand still in the sky, while simultaneously the stars remained visible, an impossibility that her rational mind rejected even as her eyes witnessed it, even as her heart, and she used this word specifically, times recognized, times it. The pattern continued throughout that day. By noon, the number of witnesses had grown to hundreds, though official counts remain unreleased, perhaps deliberately suppressed, perhaps simply too chaotic to tabulate with any accuracy. Social media posts appeared and vanished with suspicious regularity, creating a digital palimpsest of testimony that researchers are still attempting to reconstruct from cached pages and screenshot fragments. A rabbi from the ultra-Orthodox Mea Shearim neighborhood, a man known for his skepticism of modern sensationalism, broke his community's prohibition against internet use to post a single statement: "What our fathers prophesied, what our fathers' fathers preserved in whispered traditions too dangerous to write down, has begun to unfold in our generation. Prepare your hearts." The post remained visible for 11 minutes before deletion. But 11 minutes in the digital age is an eternity, long enough for thousands to capture, share, translate, disseminate across continents and time zones, carrying the message to those who had ears tuned to hear it, to those who had been waiting without quite knowing what they waited for. The witnesses came from every background imaginable: scientists and mystics, tourists and lifetime residents, believers and skeptics, the devout and the indifferent. What united them was not ideology, but geography, the simple fact of presence, of being in Jerusalem during those hours when the boundary between the seen and unseen worlds grew thin, when ancient prophecies seemed to press against the membrane of contemporary reality, testing its strength, searching for the point of rupture. And the accounts, when examined collectively, despite their fragmentation and suppression, revealed a troubling consistency, too consistent to dismiss as mass hysteria, too specific to explain as coincidence, too widespread to attribute to a single source or organized deception. Something was happening in Jerusalem, something that official channels were either unable or unwilling to acknowledge, something that existed in the space between documented fact and witnessed truth, something that required those who experienced it to choose in real time, without preparation between the comfort of conventional explanation and the terror of recognizing that the world operates according to rules far stranger and more ancient than modern certainty permits. But the witnesses were only the beginning, because what they experienced in those first hours was merely the prelude, the opening notes of a symphony that would crescendo into events that even the most apocalyptically minded among them could not have anticipated, events that would force the entire world to confront questions that civilization had spent centuries learning to avoid. The instruments do not lie, cannot lie, exist specifically to record objective truth independent of human interpretation or bias, which is why what they captured during those 72 hours presents a problem that scientists are still struggling to address in public forums, though in private conversations, in emails not meant for publication, the language shifts toward uncertainty, toward admissions that the data defies every model, every precedent, every comfortable explanation. The seismographs told the story first. At the Geophysical Institute of Israel, machines that had monitored tectonic activity beneath Jerusalem for 47 years without significant incident suddenly registered a pattern that senior geologist Dr. Moshe Rivkin described in a leaked internal memo as rhythmic, almost intentional, as though the Earth were breathing rather than shifting. The waveforms appeared on screens at precisely 4:47 a.m., the exact moment Yael felt the stones vibrate beneath the western wall. But these were not the chaotic signatures of natural earthquakes. They pulsed with regularity, with a cadence that repeated every 7 seconds, a number that made biblical scholars who later reviewed the data go very quiet, very still, because 7 carries weight in Scripture, appears in prophetic literature with a frequency that transcends coincidence. But the seismic data was only the beginning. Atmospheric sensors positioned throughout the city detected sudden pressure changes that meteorologists classify as impossible under known weather systems. The barometric readings spiked and dropped in patterns that suggested a massive storm system. Yet the skies remained clear, cloudless, the kind of perfect Mediterranean morning that draws tourists and pilgrims to the region. Temperature fluctuations of 15 degrees Celsius occurred within single minutes, confined to specific locations: the Temple Mount, the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane, while areas merely blocks away remained stable, untouched, normal. Dr. Sarah Chen, a climatologist at Hebrew University, who requested anonymity before sharing her findings with select colleagues, noted that the thermal signatures created a pattern when mapped across the Old City, a geometric configuration that aligned with sacred sites from all 3 Abrahamic faiths, as though an invisible hand were marking specific coordinates, highlighting places of ancient significance for reasons that atmospheric science cannot begin to explain. Then came the electromagnetic disturbances. Compasses throughout Jerusalem began deviating from magnetic north by margins that increased hourly, creating navigation errors that affected everything from smartphone GPS systems to aircraft instruments at Ben Gurion Airport 40 miles away. Pilots reported sudden compass swings of up to 30 degrees during approach, forcing controllers to switch to alternative guidance systems, while engineers searched desperately for technical malfunctions that did not exist, for equipment failures that could not be found. The electromagnetic data revealed something even more unsettling: pulses of energy emanating from beneath the Temple Mount at irregular intervals, frequencies that fell outside the normal spectrum of geological or human-generated radiation. These pulses were detected by equipment designed to monitor nuclear facilities, sensitive instruments that exist to warn of weapons-grade materials or catastrophic reactor failures. Yet the signatures matched neither fission nor fusion, matched nothing in the database of known energy sources, sat orphaned in the data logs, like messages written in a language that physics had not yet learned to read. And still the anomalies multiplied. Satellites passing over Jerusalem during the critical hours captured infrared imagery that NASA officials initially classified as sensor malfunction heat signatures forming and dissolving in patterns that suggested massive underground structures where archaeological surveys had documented only solid bedrock, chambers, and passageways that appeared on thermal imaging but corresponded to no known excavations, no mapped tunnels, no recorded archaeological sites. When technicians recalibrated the satellites and ran the same passes again, the thermal signatures had vanished, leaving only questions and the archived images that proved something had been there, something that existed briefly in a state that blurred the line between physical reality and something else, something that conventional instrumentation could glimpse but not properly measure, not fully capture, not adequately explain. The scientific community found itself in an impossible position, sitting on data that demanded publication, that required peer review and open analysis, yet knowing that releasing such information would invite ridicule, career destruction, accusations of fraud or incompetence or religious mania. So the data circulated quietly, passed between trusted colleagues, analyzed in private laboratories away from institutional oversight, studied by men and women who had spent their lives trusting in measurement and empiricism, who now faced evidence that suggested reality operated according to rules that their instruments could detect, but their theories could not accommodate. The machines had recorded something. The question that haunted every scientist who reviewed the data was not whether the anomalies occurred, but what they meant, and whether scientific language possessed adequate vocabulary to describe events that seemed designed to transcend purely material explanation. When the data could no longer be contained, when the witness accounts reached critical mass, when the anomalies demanded response rather than silence, the religious authorities faced a crisis that their training had prepared them for, in theory, but never in practice. The possibility that prophecy was not metaphor, not distant promise, but immediate reality unfolding in real time. The chief rabbinate of Israel convened an emergency session on Friday afternoon, mere hours before Shabbat, a scheduling choice that itself communicated urgency because such meetings are avoided at all costs during preparation for the day of rest. 11 senior rabbis gathered in chambers that had not seen such an assembly since the 1967 recapture of the Old City, and what transpired in that 4-hour session remains officially confidential, but leaks suggest debates that turned heated, then desperate, then something close to fearful. Rabbi Yitzhak Feldman, a scholar specializing in eschatological texts, reportedly stood and read passages from the prophet Ezekiel, his voice shaking as he reached chapter 38, verse 19. "Surely in that day there shall be a great shaking in the land of Israel." The room fell silent as he continued, describing fish of the sea, birds of the heavens, beasts of the field trembling, mountains thrown down, cliffs crumbling, walls falling to the ground. The descriptions matched too closely what the seismographs had recorded, what the witnesses had reported, what the evidence suggested was happening beneath their feet. But the Jewish response was only one voice in a chorus of religious reckoning. At the Vatican, Pope Benedict's successor received hourly briefings from the Franciscan Custody of the Holy Land, the order responsible for Catholic sites in Jerusalem. The reports detailed disturbances at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, accounts of pilgrims experiencing what they described as overwhelming spiritual presence, moments of clarity or vision or encounter that defied rational explanation. A cardinal whose name has not been released recommended activating protocols established centuries ago for evaluating supernatural claims, procedures that had not been seriously employed since Fatima in 1917. The evaluation process began immediately, quietly, without public announcement, but word spread through ecclesiastical networks that something in Jerusalem had prompted the Church to take seriously the possibility of divine intervention, of breakthrough between the eternal and temporal realms. And in the Muslim community, the response came swifter, more visible, more urgent. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem issued a statement calling for increased prayer at Al-Aqsa Mosque, a summons that brought thousands to the Temple Mount despite the access restrictions that authorities had quietly attempted to enforce. The faithful came anyway, flowing through checkpoints and barriers, drawn by conviction that transcended political authority, that responded to a call deeper than governmental decree. Witnesses described scenes of spontaneous worship, of men and women prostrating themselves on ancient stones, weeping prayers that mingled Arabic and Hebrew, and languages that some claimed sounded like no earthly tongue at all, utterances that emerged from throats without conscious intention, glossolalia that affected Muslim and Jew and Christian alike in those heightened moments when the barriers between traditions seemed to dissolve, when the common foundation beneath all three faiths became visible, tangible, undeniable. A video captured on smartphone, passed through encrypted channels to avoid immediate deletion, showed an elderly imam and an Orthodox rabbi standing side by side, their hands raised toward the dome of the rock, their lips moving in parallel prayer, though neither spoke the other's language, though their theologies diverged on countless points of doctrine. Yet in that moment, witnessing whatever it was that hovered unseen above the mount, they found themselves united in awe, in recognition, in the terror and exaltation that comes from encountering the holy without preparation, without mediation, without the protective barriers that ritual and tradition normally provide. Religious bookstores throughout Jerusalem reported runs on prophetic texts: Daniel, Revelation, Isaiah, the Hadith collections, dealing with end times, mystical commentaries that had gathered dust for decades, suddenly purchased by believers and skeptics alike, all seeking framework, seeking context, seeking some way to understand whether what they were witnessing marked the beginning of fulfillment or merely unprecedented natural phenomena that happened to align with ancient predictions through accident rather than design. But the texts offered no comfort, only confirmation. Every tradition, when consulted honestly, pointed toward the same terrifying conclusion that certain signs, once set in motion, cannot be stopped, only survived, only endured, until the full revelation completes itself, and the world discovers whether prophecy ends in destruction or transformation. The official statement came at 2:15 p.m. local time, delivered by a spokesperson whose face betrayed nothing, whose voice carried the practiced neutrality of one trained to communicate information without revealing how much remains unsaid. The Ministry of Interior cited routine maintenance and safety inspections as justification for the expanded security perimeter around the Old City, language so deliberately mundane that it immediately triggered suspicion among those who understood how governments speak when they are hiding something too large to fully conceal. Within 90 minutes, checkpoints that normally processed tourists and pilgrims with casual efficiency transformed into hardened security stations staffed by soldiers whose expressions suggested they had received orders they did not fully understand, but were trained to obey without question. Access to the Temple Mount became restricted to essential religious personnel only, a designation so vague that it allowed authorities to turn away anyone they chose while maintaining the appearance of respecting religious freedom. The Western Wall Plaza, typically crowded with worshippers at all hours, found itself surrounded by barriers that appeared overnight, metal and concrete structures that spoke of long-term installation rather than temporary precaution. No official explanation for the fortifications was offered, but leaked communications between the Prime Minister's office and the Israel Defense Forces paint a different picture, one of confusion at the highest levels, of decision-makers receiving intelligence reports they cannot reconcile with conventional threat assessment, of security officials trained to respond to terrorism and military aggression, now facing something that fits no existing category, no established protocol. A text message chain, obtained by an anonymous source within the Knesset, shows officials debating whether the situation required evacuation of the Old City entirely, a measure that has not been seriously considered since the 1967 war, a step that would acknowledge publicly what they were desperately trying to keep contained, that something beyond governmental control was occurring in the heart of Jerusalem, something that made geographic quarantine seem like a reasonable precaution. The debate, according to the leaked messages, centered not on whether the phenomena were real, but on how to manage public perception, how to maintain social order in the face of events that defied official narrative, how to prevent mass panic, while simultaneously preparing for contingencies that sounded like they had been pulled from apocalyptic fiction rather than disaster response manuals. One message, sent by a deputy minister whose name was redacted from the leaked documents, read simply, "The Americans are asking questions we cannot answer. They see the satellite data. They know something is happening. How long can we claim this is routine?" The American involvement added another layer to the crisis. U.S. intelligence agencies, with their sophisticated monitoring systems positioned throughout the Middle East, had access to the same anomalous data that Israeli scientists were struggling to explain. Military attaches in Tel Aviv began requesting briefings that Israeli officials could not provide without admitting the scope of the unknown, the breadth of the inexplicable. A decision was made at levels that remain unclear to classify all information related to the Jerusalem events under national security protocols, effectively making it illegal for government employees or military personnel to discuss the phenomena publicly, transforming the crisis from a matter of public interest into state secret, buried under layers of official denial and enforced silence. But silence proved impossible to maintain. Too many people had witnessed too much, had captured too many videos, had shared too many accounts, before the full weight of governmental suppression could be brought to bear. The information continued to leak, continued to spread through channels that security apparatus could monitor, but not fully control, creating a parallel narrative that circulated beneath official pronouncements, that flourished in the gaps between what authorities claimed and what citizens knew they had seen. Street vendors near the Damascus Gate reported plain-clothed officers confiscating phones from tourists who had photographed the wrong areas at the wrong times, devices disappearing into pockets, with promises of return that were never fulfilled. Hotel managers received visits from security personnel, requesting guest lists and surveillance footage, requests that carried the weight of legal authority but lacked the paperwork that would make them officially documented, officially accountable. The lockdown intensified as Friday evening approached, as Shabbat descended over the city, as the call to prayer echoed from minarets, as church bells marked the hour, all three faiths entering their sacred rhythms, even as the security perimeter tightened, even as soldiers, with orders they could not explain, took positions around sites they had been told to protect from a threat that had no name, no face, no origin that conventional intelligence could identify. And beneath the surface of enforced calm, beneath the official narrative of routine precaution, the pressure continued to build. The tension between witnessed reality and governmental denial reaching levels that could not be sustained indefinitely without something giving way, without the truth forcing itself through the barriers of silence and finding expression in ways that no amount of security protocols could prevent. The video appeared first on a platform based in Eastern Europe, uploaded by an account with no history, no profile information, no digital footprint that investigators could trace, despite efforts that reportedly involved intelligence agencies from 3 countries. The timestamp showed 5:02 a.m. Thursday morning, recorded from a rooftop overlooking the Temple Mount, the camera shaking slightly in hands that trembled either from cold or from fear or from the sheer weight of what they were documenting. For the first 40 seconds, nothing appears unusual. the golden dome catching early light, the ancient stones still shadowed, the kind of peaceful dawn scene that could illustrate any travel documentary about Jerusalem's beauty and historical significance. Then, at the 41-second mark, everything changes. The light shifts, not gradually, as sunrise naturally progresses, but suddenly, as though someone had adjusted the exposure on reality itself. Shadows that had been pointing east swing to the north without the sun moving, without any celestial body changing position. The person filming gasps, a sharp intake of breath captured clearly on the audio, followed by words in Hebrew that translate roughly as, "God of Abraham, what is this?" The camera jerks upward, focusing on the sky above the dome, and what appears there has no easy explanation, no comfortable category into which it can be filed and dismissed. Witnesses who saw the footage before its removal from public platforms describe it differently, depending on their background, their beliefs, their framework for interpreting the impossible. Some say it looked like a tear in the atmosphere, like the sky itself had been split open to reveal something beyond, something that light passed through differently, that bent the air around it in ways that made eyes, water, and minds struggle to process the visual information. Others describe a geometric pattern, precise and mathematical, that hovered or possibly emerged from the exact center point above the dome, a configuration that sacred geometry experts later claimed matched diagrams found in ancient mystical texts from multiple traditions. But all agree on one detail: the footage shows something that should not exist, according to known physics, something that cameras should not be able to capture if it were merely hallucination or mass hysteria or atmospheric phenomenon. The video continues for another 2 minutes and 17 seconds. During that time, the phenomenon, whatever it was, whatever category of existence it occupied, appears to intensify, to become more visible, more defined, until even skeptics watching the footage admit that the image shows something structured, something that possesses symmetry and purpose, something that seems to respond to or interact with the dome beneath it in ways that suggest relationship rather than coincidence. Then, abruptly, the video cuts to black. Not a natural ending, not the camera being switched off, but a sudden termination that digital forensics experts who examined the file described as consistent with electromagnetic pulse damage, the kind of shutdown that occurs when electronics are hit with energy surges that overwhelm their circuits and corrupt their data storage. The footage was mirrored across 17 platforms within the first hour of its appearance, downloaded thousands of times before coordinated removal efforts scrubbed it from mainstream sites. But the internet, as always, proved more resilient than censorship, and copies continued to surface on encrypted channels, on obscure forums, on messaging apps that prioritize privacy over compliance with governmental takedown requests. Attempts to debunk the video as computer-generated imagery or sophisticated hoax ran into immediate problems. The metadata showed no signs of editing software, no digital fingerprints of manipulation. The background elements, the specific architectural details of buildings visible in the frame, the lighting conditions, all corresponded precisely to verifiable features of that location at that specific time of morning. Independent verification came from unexpected sources. A photojournalist from Reuters, in Jerusalem covering unrelated political tensions, admitted in a private blog post that was quickly deleted that he had witnessed the same phenomenon from a different angle, but his footage had been confiscated at a checkpoint before he could transmit it to his editors. A security camera positioned on a hotel 3 blocks away captured similar anomalous light patterns during the same time window, footage that the hotel's management initially shared with local news before receiving a visit from authorities that resulted in the immediate retraction of the material and a statement claiming technical malfunction. But perhaps most compelling were the secondary effects visible in the leaked footage, details that casual viewers might miss but that careful analysis revealed: birds frozen in mid-flight, captured in a single frame against the sky, suspended as though time itself had paused. Windows in buildings surrounding the Temple Mount reflecting light that came from no visible source, glowing with luminescence that appeared to originate from within the glass itself, rather than from external illumination. And in the final frames before the video cuts to black, shapes that might be human figures might be something else entirely, standing on the mount, in positions that aerial surveys later showed should have been architecturally impossible, spaces where no platform exists, no surface that could support physical weight. The footage reached American shores at 11:47 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, spreading through religious networks first, through email chains and messaging groups that connected churches and Bible study communities, through the digital infrastructure of faith that exists beneath the surface of mainstream social media, invisible to secular observers, but vast, organized, primed for exactly this kind of information. Within 4 hours, over 2 million people across the United States had viewed the leaked video, had seen the impossible light above the dome, had heard the trembling voice speaking Hebrew words of awe and fear. Prayer chains activated across the Bible Belt, urgent requests circulating through congregations from Texas to Tennessee, from Oklahoma to the Carolinas, believers dropping to their knees in living rooms and church sanctuaries, interceding for Jerusalem, for Israel, for the world that suddenly seemed poised on the edge of prophetic fulfillment. But America was only the beginning. In South Korea, where Christianity has flourished with particular intensity, where megachurches count membership in hundreds of thousands, the response came swift and organized. Pastor David Cho of Seoul's Yoido Full Gospel Church, one of the largest congregations on earth, called for a 72-hour prayer vigil, an appeal that brought over 50,000 people to the church campus in shifts that continued day and night. Voices rising in Korean and English and heavenly languages, intercession that filled the air with sound that witnesses described as both beautiful and terrible, worship mixed with urgency, mixed with the kind of desperate pleading that comes when people sense something eternal is at stake. In Brazil, where Pentecostal faith has transformed the religious landscape, bishops and pastors shared the footage from pulpits, from television broadcasts that reach millions, declaring that the signs had begun, that the prophecies were unfolding, that the faithful must prepare their hearts, because the time of waiting had ended and the season of fulfillment had arrived. The mainstream media, by contrast, found itself paralyzed, caught between the undeniable public interest in the story and the lack of official confirmation, the absence of authoritative sources willing to go on record, the institutional resistance to reporting events that defied conventional explanation. CNN ran a brief segment on Friday afternoon, framing the footage as viral claims of supernatural events in Jerusalem, language carefully chosen to report the phenomenon without endorsing its authenticity. The segment lasted 4 minutes before cutting to commercial, but those 4 minutes generated more viewer engagement than any other story that week. Comment sections exploding with debate, with testimony, with accusations of cover-up and demands for further investigation. The BBC took a more skeptical approach, interviewing a professor of atmospheric physics who suggested the light patterns could be explained by rare refraction events, by ice crystals in the upper atmosphere, bending sunlight in unusual ways. But the professor's explanations grew less confident as the interview progressed, his certainty eroding when pressed on specific details, on the geometric precision of the patterns, on the electromagnetic data that corresponded to the visual phenomena. By Friday evening, the story had become impossible to ignore. Twitter trends showed Jerusalem-related topics occupying 8 of the top 10 positions globally, with hashtags like #Jerusalem signs and #prophecy unfolding generating millions of posts per hour. YouTube saw a 300% spike in searches for end times prophecy, for biblical interpretation of current events, for videos explaining the significance of the Temple Mount in eschatological frameworks. Stock markets began reacting to the uncertainty, to the geopolitical implications of crisis in Jerusalem, to the possibility that events in the Middle East might spiral beyond normal diplomatic or military containment. The Dow dropped 200 points in Friday trading, not catastrophic but enough to signal that investors were hedging against scenarios they could not quite name, preparing for disruptions that existed more in the realm of ancient prophecy than modern financial modeling. Oil futures climbed as analysts factored potential instability in the region, as contingency planners at energy companies began running scenarios that assumed worst-case developments, that calculated the impact of conflict or chaos radiating from Jerusalem into surrounding territories. And still the information continued to spread, continued to multiply through channels that traditional gatekeepers could not control, through person-to-person sharing that carried the weight of personal testimony rather than institutional verification, through networks of belief that had been waiting, some consciously and some without realizing it, for exactly this kind of signal, this kind of sign that the spiritual realm was no longer content to remain invisible, that the boundary between heaven and earth had grown thin enough for something to break through. Religious leaders worldwide faced impossible decisions whether to speak publicly about events they could not verify but sensed were significant, whether to remain silent and risk appearing disconnected from the moment their congregations most needed guidance, whether to interpret the signs through the lens of their traditions, or to admit that what was happening transcended denominational understanding, required a response that went deeper than theological categories, touched something primal about faith and fear, and the terrible possibility that God was no longer distant, no longer silent, no longer willing to let human history unfold without direct intervention. In the basement archives of Hebrew University, Dr. Rachel Goldstein pulled manuscripts from climate-controlled storage that had not been consulted for serious research in over 50 years. Documents written in languages that required specialized training to decipher, texts that academic consensus had relegated to the realm of mystical speculation rather than historical documentation. But the events unfolding in Jerusalem demanded a different kind of scholarship, a willingness to consider sources that modern rationalism had dismissed as primitive superstition. The Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Creation, describes in cryptic Hebrew the process by which divine light enters the material world through specific geometric configurations, through patterns that appear when the boundary between the eternal and temporal realms grows permeable. Dr. Goldstein's hands trembled as she traced the ancient diagrams with her finger, comparing them to screenshots from the leaked footage, finding correspondences that made her question whether the medieval mystics had been recording actual events rather than symbolic visions. The shapes matched too precisely to be coincidental. 3,000 miles away, at the Vatican's secret archives, Cardinal Alessandro Torretti was conducting his own investigation into texts that had been locked away for centuries, documents that the church hierarchy had deemed too dangerous for public consumption, too specific in their prophetic descriptions, to be safely studied by anyone except those with the highest clearance, the deepest training in discerning divine truth from demonic deception. The Codex Vaticanus Propheticus, written by an anonymous Franciscan monk in 1347, contained detailed descriptions of signs that would appear in Jerusalem before the final age began, visions that the monk claimed came to him during 40 days of fasting and prayer in the desert outside Bethlehem. The manuscript had been sealed by papal decree in 1623, after scholars determined that its contents were too inflammatory, too likely to inspire panic or false messianic movements. But the descriptions in the Codex aligned so closely with contemporary reports that Cardinal Torretti found himself questioning whether the Church's protective instincts had been correct, whether some knowledge was meant to remain hidden until the time of its fulfillment arrived, until the signs themselves validated the authenticity of visions that had been preserved in darkness for 700 years. When the light breaks through the dome of the sanctuary, the anonymous monk had written in Latin that required careful translation, "When the sky tears open above the place where Abraham offered Isaac, when the stones of the holy mountain vibrate with frequencies that penetrate to the foundation of the world, then shall the faithful know that the time of preparation has ended, and the season of revelation has begun." The monk's vision continued, with details that made Cardinal Torretti's blood run cold, descriptions of electromagnetic disturbances, of witnesses speaking in languages they had never learned, of governmental authorities attempting to suppress information that could not be contained. of religious leaders struggling to interpret events that exceeded their theological preparation. In the archives of Al-Azhar University in Cairo, Islamic scholars were consulting their own ancient sources, particularly the works of 12th-century mystic Ibn Arabi, whose visions of Jerusalem during the final days contained passages that contemporary events were making disturbingly relevant. The scholar had written of a time when the Dome of the Rock would become a focal point for manifestations that bridged the earthly and celestial realms, when the sacred geography of Jerusalem would serve as a conduit for divine intervention that would be visible to believers and skeptics alike. In the last days, Ibn Arabi had written in Arabic that preserved nuances lost in translation. The barriers between the seen and unseen worlds will grow thin above the holy sanctuary. Light will appear that comes not from sun, nor moon, nor star, but from the source of all illumination, the origin of all that exists. Those who witness this light will be changed, will carry within themselves knowledge that cannot be unlearned, understanding that cannot be forgotten. The convergence was undeniable. Three separate religious traditions, developing independently across centuries, had preserved remarkably similar descriptions of events that appeared to be manifesting in real time in Jerusalem. The texts had been written by mystics and prophets who claimed divine revelation, individuals whose visions had been dismissed by rationalist scholars as products of religious mania or cultural anxiety, but whose specific details were now being validated by scientific instruments and eyewitness testimony. Dr. Goldstein made a decision that would end her academic career, but preserve her integrity. She began preparing a paper that compared the ancient descriptions with contemporary evidence, a document that would argue for the historical accuracy of visionary literature, for the possibility that prophetic texts preserved genuine information about future events, rather than merely reflecting the psychological needs of their historical contexts. The paper would never be published, but her research notes, leaked to religious networks after her mysterious resignation from the university, would provide a framework for understanding that the events in Jerusalem were not random anomalies, but fulfillment of patterns that had been documented, preserved, and hidden for centuries, waiting for the generation that would witness their actualization. Saturday arrived with silence that felt heavy, pregnant with possibility, as though the entire city of Jerusalem held its breath, waiting for something that had been building momentum for 3 days to reach its inevitable crescendo. The government lockdown had cleared the streets, but behind closed doors, in private homes and secret gatherings, people watched and prayed and prepared for whatever was coming, knowing with certainty that the preliminary signs had been leading toward this moment, this culmination. At 3:33 p.m. local time, a number that would later be analyzed for its symbolic significance across multiple religious frameworks, the final sequence began. The seismographs registered it first, as they had from the beginning, but this time the patterns were different, more complex, no longer the rhythmic pulsing that had characterized the earlier phenomena, but something that resembled music, harmonic frequencies that created interference patterns, suggesting multiple sources operating in coordination, a symphony of tectonic activity that defied every known model of geological behavior. Dr. Moshe Rivkin, monitoring the data from his home computer after being officially suspended from the Geophysical Institute, watched the waveforms appear on his screen and recognized immediately that whatever was happening beneath Jerusalem had entered its final phase. The frequencies were ascending, building toward some kind of resonance point, approaching thresholds that his instruments could measure, but his experience could not interpret. At the same moment, witnesses positioned at various points around the old city, despite the security perimeter, despite the military checkpoints, despite the official restrictions, began reporting phenomena that surpassed everything that had occurred during the previous 72 hours. Yael, the tour guide whose initial testimony had started the documentation process, stood at her apartment window overlooking the western wall and watched stones that had stood for 2 millennia begin to emit light from within, not reflected illumination from external sources, but radiance that seemed to originate from the limestone itself, as though the ancient blocks had become translucent, revealing energy that had been contained within their molecular structure for centuries, waiting for the proper frequency to activate their luminous potential. The light spread from stone to stone, with visible progression, traveling along the wall from south to north like a slow wave of revelation, each block catching and amplifying the radiance until the entire structure glowed with intensity that made cameras malfunction, that forced human eyes to look away while simultaneously compelling them to witness what they could not safely observe. But the western wall was only the beginning. From her rooftop position 3 blocks away, Margaret, the retired schoolteacher from Ohio, who had described the impossible shadows on Thursday morning, saw the dome of the rock begin to resonate, to vibrate so rapidly that its golden surface appeared fluid, liquid metal flowing, without losing its architectural form. The geometric patterns that had appeared in the leaked footage, the precise configurations that ancient texts had described and scholars had dismissed, materialized fully above the dome, no longer glimpsed through atmospheric disturbance, but clearly visible, undeniably present, suspended in space with mathematical precision that suggested design rather than accident. The patterns rotated slowly, majestically, casting shadows that fell in all directions simultaneously, creating darkness and light in arrangements that violated optical physics, while somehow appearing perfectly natural, perfectly right, as though reality had been operating incorrectly until this moment, as though the universe was finally remembering how to behave according to its original specifications. And then came the sound, not heard with the ears, but felt in the bones, experienced through vibration rather than audio, a frequency that penetrated through stone and metal and flesh to reach something deeper, something that existed beyond the material components of human consciousness. Every person within a 10-kilometer radius of the old city reported experiencing it simultaneously, a tone that carried meaning without words, communication that bypassed language and spoke directly to the soul, delivering information that the rational mind could not process, but the spirit understood immediately. Those with religious training recognized it as the sound described in prophetic literature, the trumpet blast, the call of the shofar, the voice of the divine breaking through the barriers that normally separate the eternal from the temporal. But it was more than sound, more than vibration. It was presence itself, becoming audible, the signature frequency of consciousness that exists outside time and space, announcing itself to a dimension that had grown accustomed to its absence. The electromagnetic instruments that had been monitoring the anomalies throughout the week registered readings that exceeded their measurement capacity, energy levels that caused equipment failures across the city, that knocked out power grids and disrupted communication networks, that forced even the most sophisticated detection devices to surrender their attempt to quantify what was occurring. But human witnesses needed no instruments to understand that they were experiencing the climax of whatever process had been building since Thursday morning. In the Muslim quarter, worshippers at Al-Aqsa Mosque prostrated themselves as the call to prayer began spontaneously, emerging from throats without conscious intention, voices joining in Arabic and Hebrew and languages that linguists later claimed resembled no known human dialect, praise that seemed to arise from the stones themselves, from the air, from the intersection of heaven and earth, that Jerusalem had always represented but was now manifesting in ways that made metaphor unnecessary. In the Christian quarter, bells began ringing without human activation, bronze and iron vibrating in sympathy, with frequencies that came from no earthly source, creating harmonies that had never been heard before, but felt familiar, ancient, like memories of music from before the fall, before the separation between divine and human became the defining characteristic of earthly existence. In the Jewish quarter, prayer shawls began moving in wind that touched nothing else, fabric responding to currents that existed in spiritual rather than physical atmosphere, while prayer books fell open to passages that had been written for this moment, verses that spoke of veils being torn away, of heaven touching earth, of the dwelling of God being established among humanity, not in some distant future, but now, immediately, without further delay. The intensity continued to build throughout the afternoon, approaching levels that witnesses described as overwhelming, too much glory for human consciousness to contain without transformation, without fundamental alteration of perception and understanding. Some fainted, some wept, some laughed with joy that transcended rationality. Some fell to their knees in fear that was somehow mixed with perfect peace, terror that contained within itself the assurance that what they feared was good, was right, was the fulfillment of every authentic longing they had ever experienced. And at 5:47 p.m., exactly 24 hours after the first seismic readings, exactly at the moment when Sabbath was ending and a new week was beginning, when Jewish time and celestial time aligned in perfect coordination, the revelation reached its culmination. What happened in that moment would divide human history into before and after, would create a new calendar of understanding, would force every person alive to confront the possibility that reality operates according to rules far more mysterious and wonderful and terrible than civilization had dared to imagine. At 5:47 p.m., Jerusalem time, every camera pointed toward the Old City went dark simultaneously, not from technical failure, but from light so intense that electronic sensors could not process the input, could not translate the radiance into digital information without being overwhelmed, without surrendering their capacity to function in the presence of illumination that existed outside the electromagnetic spectrum that technology was designed to capture. But the darkness lasted only 17 seconds. When the cameras reactivated, when the light subsided to levels that human eyes could bear, when the intensity reduced to something that could be witnessed without permanent blindness, what they revealed changed everything that humanity thought it knew about the nature of reality, about the relationship between the physical and spiritual realms, about the possibility of divine intervention in human affairs. The Temple Mount was empty, not evacuated, not cleared by security forces, but empty in a way that suggested the very stones had been lifted away, transported to some other dimension, leaving behind space that was not merely vacant, but transformed, sanctified, made into something that existed simultaneously in Jerusalem and elsewhere, in the material world and in the eternal realm, occupying the same geographical coordinates while transcending the limitations of three-dimensional space. Where the Dome of the Rock had stood for 13 centuries, where Jewish temples had been built and destroyed and mourned for 2 millennia, where Abraham had offered Isaac and David had established his throne, and Jesus had overturned the tables of the money changers, there now existed something that witnesses struggled to describe, because human language lacks adequate vocabulary for spaces that contain infinity while remaining bounded, for architecture that is both visible and beyond sight, for structures that exist in multiple realities simultaneously. Some called it the New Jerusalem descended from heaven, the holy city described in Revelation but manifested in physical form, touchable and material, yet somehow eternal, existing outside time while occupying space in history. Others recognized it as the Third Temple, built not by human hands but by divine intention, constructed from light and glory and the crystallized prayers of centuries, containing within its boundaries the presence that Moses had encountered in the burning bush, that Ezekiel had seen in visions, that had been promised to return to Zion in the last days. Still others saw it simply as the restoration of Eden, the garden returned to earth, the original harmony between heaven and ground re-established in the place where Abraham had first encountered the God of Israel, where the boundary between the human and divine had always been thinner than anywhere else on the planet. But all agreed on the essential fact: something had changed permanently, irreversibly, in the fundamental structure of reality itself. The effects rippled outward from Jerusalem like waves from a stone dropped into still water, touching every corner of the earth with varying intensity but universal impact. Prayer became different words, spoken with sincere faith, now carried power that could be measured, could produce effects that scientific instruments could detect, that medical equipment could record, that even the most committed skeptics could no longer explain away as coincidence or wishful thinking. Healing began occurring spontaneously in hospitals around the world, not through medical intervention, but through the simple presence of people who had been praying with genuine faith, who had opened themselves to possibilities that rational materialism had taught them to dismiss. Cancer remissions without treatment, paralyzed patients walking without physical therapy, mental illnesses disappearing overnight in individuals who had suffered for decades. But perhaps more significant than the miraculous healings were the changes in human consciousness itself, the way that exposure to even second-hand reports of the Jerusalem event began altering people's capacity for spiritual perception, for recognizing the sacred in ordinary circumstances, for experiencing the presence of the divine in ways that had been available to mystics and saints throughout history, but now seemed accessible to anyone willing to open their hearts to the possibility. Children born after 5:47 p.m. Jerusalem time on that Saturday evening would grow up in a world where the boundary between the natural and supernatural had become permanently permeable, where prayer was no longer hope but communication, where faith was no longer belief but recognition, where the ancient promises of every authentic spiritual tradition had been fulfilled in ways that exceeded even the boldest prophetic imagination. The governments of the world would spend months trying to develop policies for managing a reality in which their authority was no longer ultimate, in which citizens had access to sources of guidance and power that operated outside official channels, outside institutional control. Science would require complete renovation, new categories for phenomena that could be observed but not manipulated, for effects that could be documented but not replicated through materialist methodology, for evidence that pointed toward conclusions that contradicted everything the educational system had taught about the nature of existence. And in Jerusalem, where it all began, where the ancient promises had found their fulfillment, pilgrims would come by the millions to witness for themselves the place where heaven had touched earth, where the eternal had entered time, where humanity had been offered a glimpse of what was always meant to be. But what they would find there would be only the beginning of revelations that would continue to unfold, continue to transform the world in ways that no prophet had dared to imagine, in directions that would challenge every assumption about the future of human civilization.